Imagine a decision so brutal, so morally compromising, that it echoes through history, forever staining the banner of victory. A decision born of the crucible of total war, where the lines between combatant and helpless victim blurred into a terrifying blood-soaked haze. This isn't just a story of audacious military innovation, of daring pilots and sinking ships. This is a journey into the darkest corners of human conflict, where the price of strategic success was measured not only in lives lost, but in the very soul of those who fought. Today, we delve into one of the most controversial chapters of World War II in the Pacific, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. A battle that showcased American ingenuity and overwhelming air power, but also revealed the chilling depths of wartime necessity, leaving behind a legacy of technological triumph and profound moral reckoning. March 3, 1943. The emerald waters of the Bismarck Sea, off the coast of New Guinea, shimmered under a deceptively peaceful morning sun. Beneath that serene surface, a drama of desperate ambition and ruthless determination was about to unfold, a confrontation that would redefine naval warfare and challenge the very ethics of combat. For the Imperial Japanese Army, this wasn't just another convoy, it was a desperate gamble, a lifeline. New Guinea, a vast and unforgiving island, had become a critical battleground. The town of Law was a linchpin, and its garrison was in dire need of reinforcement. They were facing relentless pressure from Allied forces, and without fresh troops and supplies, their position was untenable. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The future of Japanese operations in the entire Southwest Pacific hung precariously in the balance. If Law fell, the dominoes would begin to tumble, potentially exposing Australia itself to further threats. Enter Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, a man whose career hadn't been marked by spectacular brilliance, but by the quiet competence forged in the unforgiving furnace of war. He graduated 107th out of 118 cadets from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, hardly a shining star. Yet, the brutal realities of combat had taught him lessons no textbook ever could. He'd seen firsthand the devastating power of American air superiority, having assisted in rescuing survivors from the heavy cruiser Mikuma after it was savaged by American bombs at the Battle of Midway. He understood the peril of Japanese ships caught in daylight, exposed and vulnerable, without adequate fighter cover. It was a haunting premonition of the fate that awaited him. His mission was a poisoned chalice. He commanded Destroyer Squadron 3, a formidable screen of 8 battle-hardened destroyers: Shirayuki, Shikanami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo. Each of these vessels had survived the savage fighting around Guadalcanal, their crews veterans of brutal night engagements where Japanese destroyer tactics had often proven superior. But this was different. This was broad daylight, in waters where American land-based aircraft reigned supreme, unchallenged and unopposed. Kimura knew the odds were stacked against him, but he had no choice. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had issued the order, and the alternative, a grueling 140-mile march through disease-ridden jungle without roads for thousands of men, was even more unthinkable. Packed into the holds of his 8 transports were 6,900 troops of the elite Japanese 51st Division, along with ammunition, fuel, and the last vestiges of hope for the New Guinea campaign. The presence of high-ranking officers like Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the Japanese 18th Army, and Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano of the 51st Division underscored the critical importance of this convoy. These were not expendable troops. They were the best Japan had to offer, their arrival at La potentially a game-changer. The convoy had departed Simpson Harbor at Rabaul just after midnight on March 1st, hoping to use storm fronts as natural concealment. But the storms, like so many elements of this unfolding tragedy, would offer only fleeting respite. On the other side of the strategic chessboard, at his headquarters in Port Moresby, Lieutenant General George Churchill Kenny, commander of the U.S. 5th Air Force, meticulously studied reconnaissance photographs of the Japanese convoy. Kenny was a different breed of commander, a maverick who had arrived in the Southwest Pacific in July 1942 to find General Douglas MacArthur's air forces demoralized and largely ineffective. Traditional bombing tactics, often executed from medium altitudes, had been largely useless against moving ships, yielding dismal hit rates of less than 1%. The conventional wisdom of the time, rooted in pre-war doctrine, championed precision bombing from high altitudes, often utilizing the complex Norden bombsight. This technological marvel promised pinpoint accuracy, a theoretical ideal for static industrial targets, but proved woefully inadequate against ships capable of evasive maneuvers. By the time a bomb fell from 10,000 feet, the target could be long gone. Kenny understood that a paradigm shift was needed, a radical departure from established norms. He possessed what his predecessors lacked: an innovative mind, a willingness to challenge ingrained doctrine, and the engineering expertise to transform audacious ideas into devastating realities. Beside him, examining the same photographs, stood the key figure in this transformation: Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Gunn was a former enlisted Navy aviator, a man fueled by a deeply personal fury. His wife and children remained trapped in the Philippines, held captive by the very enemy he now sought to destroy. That personal anguish was channeled into a revolutionary overhaul of American aircraft and tactics. Gunn understood a fundamental truth about attacking ships. You had to get close. Very, very close. And to do that, you first had to suppress the ship's anti-aircraft fire, to blind and deafen the enemy before delivering the killing blow. His solution was brilliantly simple, yet profoundly effective. Modify B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. Remove the bombardier's position in the nose and install 8 forward-firing 50-caliber Browning machine guns. These modified B-25 C-1s were not just bombers. They were flying weapon platforms, each capable of spitting out 850 rounds per minute per gun. That's a staggering 6,800 rounds per minute of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Enough firepower to shred a ship's superstructure, devastate its deck, and, most importantly, slaughter its anti-aircraft crews, silencing their defenses before the bombs even dropped. This unprecedented firepower allowed for the development of a new tactic, one that would become the signature of the Bismarck Sea battle: skip bombing. Pilots would approach at wave-top height, barely skimming the surface of the water, and release their bombs approximately 500 yards from the target. The bombs, like stones skipped across a pond, would bounce across the water, detonating against the ship's hull below the waterline, precisely where the armor was thinnest and most vulnerable. It was an audacious, incredibly dangerous maneuver, requiring immense skill and nerves of steel, but it promised to bypass the inherent weaknesses of traditional high-altitude bombing. As Kenny and Gunn finalized their plans, they understood the far-reaching implications. This wasn't merely about sinking Japanese ships. It was about crushing Japan's last realistic chance to reinforce law by sea. If the convoy succeeded, Japanese forces might stabilize their position, potentially prolonging the war in New Guinea and threatening Allied gains. If it failed, Japan would be forced to rely on submarines and small coastal barges, effectively ceding control of New Guinea's vital waters to Allied forces. This battle was not just a tactical engagement, it was a strategic turning point. Major Ed Old Man Larner, commander of the 90th Bombardment Squadron's B-25s, was tasked with leading this innovative skip bombing attack. Larner was a veteran, and he drove his crews relentlessly. Their training ground was a half-submerged wreck in Port Moresby Harbor. There, pilots learned to discard the complex Norden bomb site and instead use crude but effective reference points on their aircraft's nose, releasing bombs at the precise moment to achieve the flat trajectory skip bombing demanded. It was a perilous training regimen. One crew was tragically killed when their B-25 struck the target wreck's mast. Yet, Larner's remaining pilots, through sheer grit and repetition, developed an almost uncanny accuracy with this unconventional technique. They were pushing the boundaries of aviation, transforming medium bombers into specialized attack aircraft, adapting 1943 technology for a mission their designers had never envisioned. The B-25C-1 Mitchell, weighing over 21,000 pounds empty, capable of carrying 3,200 pounds of bombs at 275 mm, was now, thanks to guns modifications, something entirely new. An aircraft that could both strafe and bomb with devastating effectiveness. The forward-firing armament alone added over 1,200 pounds of weight, demanding reinforced structures to absorb the incredible recoil of 850 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. The attack would not be an American-only affair. Crucial support would come from Royal Australian Air Force units. 13 Bristol Beaufighter twin-engine fighters from No. 30 Squadron, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, were perfectly suited for suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Unlike the B-25s, Beaufighters were designed as dedicated fighters, with pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, making them survivable in intense combat. Their role was clear: sweep the convoy's decks clean of gunners just before the skip bombers arrived, maximizing the American B-25's chances of survival during their perilous low-altitude runs. It was a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction, a symphony of coordinated air power designed to overwhelm and obliterate. Dawn broke on March 2nd, the Japanese convoy still some 200 miles from Luxor. Kimura's radio operators intercepted increasing American radio traffic, an ominous sign that attack preparations were well underway. The admiral faced an agonizing dilemma: press on toward La, accepting the certainty of a devastating air attack, or disperse his convoy, effectively condemning most of his transports to submarine attacks in the narrow, treacherous waters approaching New Guinea. It was a choice between two terrible fates. The first American attack arrived at 10 o'clock a.m. on March 2nd. 8 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers approached from 7,000 feet, representing America's pre-war bombing philosophy. These 4-engine aircraft were designed for precision high-altitude attacks against industrial targets, not moving ships. Their 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs created spectacular waterspouts, but achieved only one direct hit, sinking the transport Kyakuzi Maru. However, the attack had a more significant, albeit unintended, consequence. It scattered the convoy's tight formation. The ships, once a cohesive unit, were now spread across several miles of ocean, becoming isolated targets, even more vulnerable to the low-level assault that Kenny was meticulously preparing. From the bridge of his flagship, Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura watched with growing concern. One transport lost, others scattered, and this was just the prelude. Intelligence reports confirmed what he already feared. American air strength in New Guinea had surged, with new aircraft and tactics unlike anything Japanese forces had previously encountered. His greatest fear wasn't merely the bombs, it was the prospect of his ships being caught scattered, unable to provide the mutual anti-aircraft support that was their only real defense when the main attack inevitably arrived. Throughout the night of March 2nd, 3rd, the eerie silhouettes of Royal Australian Air Force Consolidated PBY Catalina flying boats shadowed the convoy, their continuous position reports feeding Kenny's forces the precise intelligence needed to plan their final, decisive assault. These twin-engine seaplanes, capable of over 20 hours airborne, were ideal for long-range reconnaissance, their crews knowing that maintaining contact was paramount, despite the vulnerability of their slow, lumbering aircraft to any Japanese fighter patrols. As March 3rd dawned, clear and calm, Kimura found himself commanding a convoy that had already lost 1/8 of its transport capacity, still 60 miles from Lae. His destroyers had rescued 950 survivors from Kyakuzi Maru, their decks now dangerously overcrowded, carrying hundreds of soldiers in addition to their regular crews. The scattered formation, a direct consequence of the previous day's B-17 attack, meant that when the next wave hit, his ships would face it individually, their combined anti-aircraft fire diluted and ineffective. At 7:30 a.m., reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the worst. Allied bombers were taking off from airfields around Port Moresby. Kimura ordered his ships to close formation and prepare for coordinated evasive action. But he knew the fundamental disadvantage was insurmountable. Japanese air cover consisted of only about 100 fighters based at Lae, lacking the range for continuous protection. American forces, by contrast, could attack from multiple airfields, with different aircraft types, arriving in carefully coordinated waves. The stage was set for a disaster. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it would come to be known, began in earnest at 10:00 a.m. on March 3rd. The first wave of Allied aircraft appeared on the horizon, an ominous cloud of steel and fire. Kimura immediately ordered all ships to increase speed and begin evasive maneuvers, but his options were severely limited by the convoy's tight formation and the lumbering transports. These ships, laden with troops and supplies, could not match the speed or agility of the destroyers. The warships faced a terrible choice: abandon their charges or accept the limitations imposed by escorting slow-moving targets. They chose loyalty, a decision that sealed their fate. First came the 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, approaching at wave-top height. Their distinctive twin-engine roar was a sound Japanese lookouts had learned to dread. Originally designed as night fighters, their 4 20mm Hispano cannons and 6 machine guns made them terrifying strafing platforms. The 20mm cannons, firing explosive shells, could penetrate light armor and tear apart exposed equipment, far more destructive than simple machine gun bullets. The Beaufighter attack executed Kenny's tactical plan flawlessly. All 13 aircraft came in from the starboard side, concentrating their fire in one sector. This deliberate tactic forced Japanese anti-aircraft gunners to focus their attention, leaving other areas of the ship's defenses temporarily unmanned, creating the critical opening for guns modified B-25s. The timing was everything. A symphony of coordinated destruction, each pilot understanding that success hinged on split-second precision between vastly different aircraft types. Major Larner then led his 12 B-25 C-1 strafers into the fray, just moments after the Beaufighters completed their runs. Flying at a mere 30 feet above the waves, at a blistering 230 mph, these American bombers presented targets that Japanese gunners found almost impossible to track. Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine, designed for medium-altitude attacks, crumbled against this low-level assault. Skip bombers compressed the entire attack into seconds, denying defenders the time to calculate range and deflection. The sound of Larner's B-25s was unlike anything the Japanese sailors had ever experienced. 850 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a cacophony that one survivor chillingly described as like a giant canvas being torn apart by invisible hands. Each aircraft carried 3,840 rounds of mixed ammunition, armor-piercing to rip through steel, incendiary to ignite fires, and tracers to guide the pilot's aim. At 200 yards, these weapons could penetrate the hull plating of any destroyer and slaughter exposed personnel with devastating effectiveness. The Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, took the first concentrated burst from Larner's lead aircraft, just as the Admiral was frantically ordering emergency turns. 50 caliber bullets ripped across the destroyer's bridge, killing or wounding most of the officers and men stationed there. Admiral Kimura himself was struck in the shoulder and stomach, wounds that would have been fatal without immediate medical attention. That same devastating burst also destroyed the ship's primary fire control equipment, rendering her anti-aircraft guns directionless. The skip bombing technique, perfected by Gunn and Larner, proved catastrophically effective against ships designed to resist conventional high-altitude attacks. Naval armor traditionally concentrated protection around vital areas like magazines and engine rooms, anticipating bombs falling from above. Skip bombs, however, struck from the side, targeting areas where hull plating was thinnest and least protected. A 500-pound bomb detonating against a destroyer's side could tear open compartments below the waterline, causing uncontrollable flooding that would doom the ship within minutes. The transport ships, designed for cargo capacity rather than combat survivability, proved even more vulnerable. With minimal armor and inadequate subdivision to contain flooding, they were death traps. When B-25s attacked the transport Taime Maru, their combined machine gun fire scythed down dozens of soldiers packed into the ship's holds, while bombs tore massive holes in her hull. The vessel began sinking immediately, forcing hundreds of troops to leap into seas that would soon be choked with debris, fuel oil, and blood. The systematic destruction of Kimura's convoy unfolded with grim mechanical precision. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft found their targets scattered, isolated, and unable to provide mutual support. B-17 flying fortresses continued their medium-altitude attacks, while B-25 strafers skimmed the waves, forcing Japanese gunners to divide their attention between threats approaching from vastly different angles. Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers further compounded the confusion, attacking from yet another angle, their crews employing the same low-level tactics that had proven so devastating for the modified B-25s. As ships across the convoy began to sink, thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors found themselves plunged into the water, clinging to life preservers, floating debris, or relying solely on their swimming ability. The transports carried Type A and Type B landing craft, theoretically capable of evacuating troops, but most of these had been destroyed by relentless strafing before they could even be launched. Those few landing craft that did make it into the water, carrying 30 to 90 men each, represented only a tiny fraction of the convoy's total personnel. Admiral Kimura, bleeding heavily from his wounds, was transferred from the sinking Shirayuki to the destroyer Shikinami as American aircraft continued their relentless attacks. From his new flagship, he witnessed the full extent of the unfolding disaster. All 8 transports were either sinking or ablaze, and 3 of his 8 destroyers had been sunk or fatally damaged. The carefully planned reinforcement of La had become a massacre, thousands of elite Japanese troops dying before they could even fire a shot in defense of New Guinea. The 4 surviving destroyers, Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo, began desperate rescue operations, pulling survivors from the oil-slicked water as quickly as their exhausted crews could manage. These warships, designed to carry about 240 officers and men each, now took aboard hundreds of additional survivors from the sunken vessels. Overcrowding became so severe that some destroyers had survivors lashed to their decks, exposed to subsequent air attacks, but alive when they might otherwise have drowned. Lieutenant General George Kenny, back at his headquarters, watched the initial reports of his attack's success with a chilling satisfaction. But he knew the battle was far from over. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 6,000 Japanese troops had been aboard the convoy's transports, and many were still alive in the water or clinging to the scattered lifeboats and landing craft that had somehow survived the initial assaults. If these survivors reached shore, they could still reinforce Law's garrison and potentially stabilize Japanese positions in New Guinea. The mission to prevent Japanese reinforcement at any cost had not yet reached its grim conclusion. The decision that followed would make the Battle of the Bismarck Sea one of the most controversial and morally agonizing episodes of the entire Pacific War. It came during Kenny's staff conference on the afternoon of March 3rd. Major General Ennis Whitehead, Kenny's deputy commander, pointed out the obvious. Hundreds of Japanese were still alive in lifeboats, rafts, and landing craft, scattered across the vast battle area. Many of these craft had small engines and could potentially reach the New Guinea coast within days. Even those without power might drift ashore or be rescued by Japanese submarines. Kenny's response, etched into the memories of the aircrew who received his orders, was stark, unambiguous, and utterly brutal. I want every goddamn Japanese in the water killed. I don't want any of them reaching shore to fight us again. This wasn't just impulsive rage. Kenny's language reflected the brutal intensity of Pacific War combat. Yes, but also a cold, calculated assessment that eliminating these survivors was a military necessity. These weren't merchant sailors or civilian passengers. They were elite combat troops whose survival could directly impact future battles, prolong the war, and cost more Allied lives. In the grim calculus of total war, where every enemy soldier represented a potential threat, compassion was a luxury that commanders felt they could not afford. The line between preventing reinforcement and executing defenseless survivors was razor thin, and in that moment, Kenny crossed it. The orders that went out to Allied squadrons on the afternoon of March 3rd were euphemistically described as mopping up operations, but their intent was unmistakable. Aircraft were to seek out and attack any lifeboats, rafts, or other vessels containing Japanese survivors. The justification provided to aircrews hammered home the point. These men were soldiers who would rejoin the fighting if rescued, not helpless shipwreck victims entitled to mercy. This instruction sparked a profound and lasting internal conflict for many. Some pilots, particularly those who had witnessed Japanese atrocities against prisoners or civilians, and there were many documented instances of such horrors in the Pacific, accepted this reasoning without question, even approaching these missions with a grim satisfaction. They saw it as payback, as preventing further suffering. For others, however, these orders were deeply disturbing, seeming to violate traditional concepts of military honor and the unwritten rules of warfare. Squadron commanders generally supported the missions, viewing them as unpleasant but undeniable military necessities, even as they privately acknowledged the moral ambiguity inherent in such commands. Royal Australian Air Force Squadron 30 received the first specific orders to strafe Japanese survivors. On the afternoon of March 3rd, 10 Bristol Beaufighters took off from Mill Bay with explicit instructions to locate and destroy any barges, lifeboats, or rafts still afloat in the battle area. The pilots found their targets spread across nearly 20 square miles of ocean. Type A and B landing craft packed with 30 to 90 survivors each, standard ships' lifeboats carrying 6 to 12 men, and improvised rafts cobbled together from debris. Flight Lieutenant Ronald Urin led the first systematic strafing attack on Japanese survivors. His Beaufighter's 4 20mm cannons tore apart a Type A landing craft loaded with approximately 60 soldiers. The explosive shells, designed to destroy aircraft, proved devastatingly effective against unarmored boats, turning wood and metal into deadly splinters that killed or wounded everyone aboard. Uran's wingman attacked a second landing craft with similar horrific results, leaving only debris and bodies floating in water that quickly turned red with blood. The image of the crimson-tinged sea became a haunting metaphor for the moral cost of victory. The psychological impact on Allied aircrew was as varied as human nature itself. Some pilots, hardened by months or years of brutal combat, witnessing the atrocities committed by Japanese forces against their comrades and civilians, approached these strafing missions with a chilling, almost detached efficiency, viewing them as a necessary evil, a grim component of the larger war. They dehumanized the enemy, a coping mechanism born of the intense violence surrounding them. As one co-pilot, First Lieutenant John Donegan of the 405th Bombardment Squadron starkly wrote in his diary, "Our destruction was not for mercy. It was simply that to us all, Japanese soldiers had become things to be annihilated, not necessarily cruelly, but always thoroughly." This dehumanization was a protective shell, allowing them to carry out acts that in peacetime would be unimaginable. But for others, the attacks were deeply disturbing. They struggled with the dissonance between their training as soldiers and the perceived violation of their moral code. Later, many would describe feelings of nausea, shame, and profound unease that persisted long after the war ended. These were men who had flown daring missions, faced certain death, and engaged in acts of immense courage, yet found themselves profoundly troubled by the cold-blooded targeting of defenseless individuals. One might compare it to the ethical quandaries faced by soldiers in modern conflicts, who must decide when to engage a retreating enemy, or how to distinguish combatants from civilians in a confusing battle space. The core dilemma remains: what is permissible when the stakes are existential? American B-25 crews received similar orders on March 4th, with specific instructions to seek out and destroy any remaining Japanese survivors or rescue vessels. Captain Charles Howe of the 90th Bombardment Squadron reported attacking a cluster of lifeboats and rafts some 40 miles southeast of Finschhofen, expending 2,500 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during 3 strafing passes. His after-action report noted, with a chilling military euphemism, that personnel in the water had been definitely put out of action. This sterile language, designed to sanitize the horrific reality, highlighted the moral tightrope walked by military commands and individuals alike. The systematic hunting of Japanese survivors continued for 3 days after the main battle, with Allied aircraft ranging across hundreds of square miles of ocean to ensure that virtually no one escaped. PT boats from the U.S. Navy's Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron also joined the grim pursuit, using their machine guns to attack survivors at point-blank range during night operations. Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins led 8 PT boats in these attacks, later reporting the destruction of numerous lifeboats and the killing of hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors. These were the brutal realities of a total war, where the enemy was not just defeated, but utterly annihilated. Amidst this methodical slaughter, desperate rescue operations were mounted by the Japanese. Submarines I-17 and I-26 attempted to recover survivors during the nights of March 4th and 5th, managing to rescue a mere 275 men before Allied air patrols forced them to submerge. These submarines, representing Japan's most advanced underwater technology, could accommodate only a tiny fraction of the men still alive in the water. The submarine commanders faced agonizing decisions, often forced to leave wounded men behind, prioritizing those with the best chances of survival, a grim testament to the overwhelming scale of the disaster. The moral complexity of the strafing operations became starkly apparent in the widely varying reactions of the Allied aircrews. Several Australian pilots reported feeling distasteful about attacking defenseless survivors, their internal compasses recoiling from the task. Some American crews questioned whether the strafing missions were consistent with international law, grappling with the ethical implications of their actions. Squadron commanders typically addressed these concerns by reiterating the absolute military necessity of preventing enemy reinforcement and, crucially, by reminding crews of the documented Japanese atrocities committed against Allied prisoners and civilians. This cycle of violence and retribution, this mutual dehumanization, became a tragic hallmark of the Pacific theater, influencing decisions that would have been unthinkable in earlier, more chivalrous conflicts. The strategic impact of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea extended far beyond the immediate destruction of Kimura's convoy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, described the defeat as unbelievable and a crushing blow that fundamentally altered Japan's ability to operate in the Southwest Pacific. The loss of 8 transports and 4 destroyers represented a significant portion of Japan's remaining merchant shipping, vessels that could not be replaced, given the devastating impact of American submarine warfare on Japanese shipbuilding capabilities and raw material supply lines. More importantly, the battle unequivocally demonstrated that Japan could no longer move large convoys through waters controlled by Allied land-based aircraft. Future reinforcement efforts would be forced to rely on submarines, small coastal vessels, and the extremely hazardous overland routes that Japanese planners had desperately sought to avoid. This logistical strangulation would prove decisive in the New Guinea campaign, slowly but inexorably forcing Japanese forces to fight with inadequate supplies and reinforcements, while Allied strength continued to grow unchecked. La, the ultimate prize, fell to Allied forces in September 1943, followed by other Japanese strongholds as the campaign inexorably progressed. The Bismarck Sea had sounded the death knell for Japanese ambitions in the region. The international legal implications of the survivor strafing would not become clear until after the war ended, when humanity was forced to confront the moral wreckage of global conflict. The 1949 Geneva Convention, a landmark achievement in international humanitarian law, specifically prohibited attacks on shipwrecked military personnel. Many historians believe this provision was directly influenced by incidents like the Battle of the Bismarck Sea and the Laconia incident. During World War II, however, no clear international law protected military survivors of sunken warships, leaving commanders to make agonizing decisions based on perceived military necessity and their own personal morality. The Laconia incident, which occurred in September 1942, provides a stark parallel that highlights the moral ambiguity surrounding attacks on survivors. In that tragic event, the German U-boat U-156, having torpedoed the British transport ship Laconia, began attempting to rescue survivors, including Allied prisoners of war, only to be attacked by Allied aircraft while displaying Red Cross flags. This incident led to the infamous Laconia Order, which explicitly prohibited German submarines from attempting future rescue operations, effectively condemning thousands of Allied merchant sailors to death in subsequent attacks. The similarities between the Laconia incident and the Bismarck Sea strafing reflected the total war mentality that characterized World War II combat. Both German and Allied commanders faced situations where traditional concepts of military honor and compassion clashed violently with what they perceived as existential military necessity. The resulting decisions often involved accepting moral compromises that would have been unthinkable in earlier conflicts, but seemed grimly justified by the apocalyptic stakes involved in global warfare. Post-war analysis of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea revealed the extent to which revolutionary tactics had fundamentally transformed naval warfare. Skip bombing, the brainchild of Paul Gunn and Ed Larner, had proven devastatingly more effective against ships than traditional high-altitude precision bombing. The concentration of firepower achieved by guns modified B-25s exceeded that of many contemporary fighters, while retaining the bomb-carrying capacity of medium bombers. These innovations would profoundly influence aircraft design and tactical doctrine for decades after the war ended, showcasing the transformative power of adapting existing technology to entirely new operational paradigms. The human cost of this battle reflected the broader, unforgiving brutality of Pacific War combat. Japanese casualties totaled approximately 3,000 killed and missing, including many of the elite 51st Division troops who had been designated to defend Lae. Allied losses, by contrast, numbered only 13 aircrew and 4 aircraft, a staggering ratio that demonstrated the overwhelming advantage achieved through technological innovation and tactical surprise. For the families of Japanese soldiers and sailors lost in the battle, however, statistics provided little comfort, only a gnawing emptiness and unanswerable questions. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, despite his severe wounds, survived and was evacuated to Japan for medical treatment. However, his career effectively ended with the Bismarck Sea defeat, a bitter stain on his record. Post-war interviews revealed his enduring bitterness about the inadequate air cover provided for his convoy and the unrealistic expectations placed on naval forces operating within range of overwhelming enemy land-based aircraft. Like many Japanese officers, Kimura struggled to comprehend how his country's initial advantages in naval aviation had been so completely reversed by the relentless engine of American industrial production and the agile adaptability of American tactical innovation. He was a man caught in the unforgiving current of historical change, unable to stem the tide. The aircrews who participated in the survivor strafing carried their experiences in vastly different ways throughout the remainder of their lives. Some, like Captain Charles Howe, continued to defend the missions as brutal but necessary military actions that shortened the war and ultimately saved Allied lives. They compartmentalized their actions, viewing them as a grim duty, a strategic imperative. Others, however, particularly those who directly witnessed the destruction of lifeboats filled with wounded men, struggled with memories that no amount of military justification could fully resolve. The psychological impact of these missions contributed significantly to what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder among World War II veterans, a silent, unseen wound that festered long after the roar of battle had faded. The ethical burden weighed heavily on these individuals, even as the world around them celebrated victory. Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, the architect of the B-25 modifications, continued refining his aircraft throughout the war, eventually developing B-25 variants that carried as many as 18 forward-firing machine guns. His innovations directly influenced the design of specialized attack aircraft like the Douglas A-26 Invader, which incorporated many of the lessons learned from the modified B-25s. Gunn's personal motivation never wavered. Every Japanese soldier or sailor killed was, for him, one less enemy who might threaten his family, still trapped in the occupied Philippines. His was a vengeance channeled through engineering, a personal vendetta writ large on the canvas of global conflict. General Douglas MacArthur described the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time, rhetoric that reflected both the undeniable magnitude of the victory and its immense propaganda value in demonstrating Allied air superiority. The battle's strategic significance became painfully apparent over subsequent months as Japanese forces in New Guinea found themselves increasingly isolated, unable to receive adequate reinforcements or supplies. This logistical strangulation, cemented by the Bismarck Sea defeat, proved to be a decisive factor in the ultimate Allied victory in New Guinea. The technological legacy of the battle extended beyond aviation into broader questions of military innovation and adaptation. The astounding success of skip bombing demonstrated the invaluable importance of challenging established doctrine when circumstances demanded entirely new approaches. Traditional medium-altitude bombing had proven ineffective against moving ships, but creative modification of existing aircraft and radical tactical shifts had achieved devastating results. This pattern of innovation under intense pressure would characterize much of America's technological development throughout World War II, laying the groundwork for future military advancements. The moral questions raised by the survivor strafing remain subjects of intense historical debate, 8 decades after the battle occurred. Military historians generally acknowledge the missions as violations of traditional military honor, while carefully noting the absence of clear international law governing such situations during World War II. The development of specific protections for shipwrecked military personnel in the 1949 Geneva Conventions represented an explicit, international recognition that such incidents should never be repeated in future conflicts. It was a global acknowledgement of a line that, in the heat of battle, had been crossed. Contemporary understanding of the battle must, however, consider the brutal context of Pacific War combat that influenced the behavior of all participants. Japanese forces had established patterns of treating prisoners with extreme cruelty, while Allied forces had witnessed horrific atrocities that inevitably fueled desires for revenge and a hardened resolve to eliminate the enemy at any cost. The mutual dehumanization that resulted from this escalating cycle of violence made decisions like the survivor strafing far more likely, even as individual participants grappled with the profound moral complexity involved. It was a grim reflection of how total war warps not just nations, but the individuals within them. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea ultimately demonstrated both the devastating effectiveness of innovative military tactics and the profound moral compromises that total war imposed on all participants. Admiral Kimura's convoy had represented Japan's last realistic hope of reinforcing New Guinea by sea, while General Kenny's ruthless response had ensured that such attempts could not be repeated. The price of this strategic victory included not only the 3,000 Japanese military personnel who died in the battle and its aftermath, but also the enduring moral burden carried by Allied air crews who participated in the survivor strafing. The technological innovations pioneered during the battle would influence military aviation for decades, shaping the very nature of modern warfare. Simultaneously, the profound moral questions raised by the survivor strafing would contribute directly to the development of international humanitarian law, a testament to humanity's ongoing struggle to codify ethics even in the most brutal of conflicts. Both legacies reflect the complex, often contradictory nature of military innovation during wartime, where tactical necessity and moral considerations often conflict in ways that seem irreconcilable. The men who fought and died in the Bismarck Sea deserve to be remembered not only for their courage and sacrifice, but also for the impossibly difficult moral choices their circumstances imposed. As the sun set on March 5, 1943, the waters of the Bismarck Sea contained only debris and bodies, a silent, grim marker of the location where Japan's last desperate attempt to reinforce New Guinea by sea had ended in catastrophic failure. The strategic implications would shape the remainder of the Pacific War, while the moral questions raised by the survivor strafing would continue to influence international law and military ethics for generations to come. In the end, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented both the devastating effectiveness of American industrial innovation and tactical genius and the profound moral complexity that characterized World War II's total war environment. It serves as a stark reminder that in the crucible of conflict, humanity is often forced to make choices that achieve victory at an unbearable ethical cost, leaving behind not just shattered ships and lost lives, but the lingering echoes of what it truly means to wage war. The lesson, then, is not merely one of strategy or technology, but a timeless admonition about the moral frontier of warfare. A frontier that, once crossed, leaves an indelible mark on all involved and on the very fabric of history itself.